We're going to give everyone a few minutes to settle in before we start, so we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, everyone, I'm going to begin our introductions while people are still joining us so that we have the maximum amount of time. Thank you for coming to the Political Landscaping, Environment, Empire, and Science Roundtable. We have four wonderful and very appropriate speakers for this topic. We have Joanne Yao, who's a lecturer in international relations at Queen Mary University. Her work centers on environmental history, historical and politics, and historical international relations. And she looks at the very first IOs and has a forthcoming book on the Danube River Commission. Next speaking will be Bentley Allan. He's associate professor at Johns Hopkins. Bentley, you have an error in your bio and Hopkins. It still says assistant in the text, so you want to change that. He has an absolutely wonderful book called Scientific Cosmology and International Orders, which won the APSA's Don K. Prize Award for the best book in science, technology, and environmental studies. He's working on a second book on geopolitics and climate governance. And he's also involved in the National Identity Project with Sergeant Vukatek and Ted Hopf. Our next speaker will be Oanne Barak. He is, I don't want to get your rank wrong, professor at Tel Aviv. He's a social and cultural historian of science and technology in non-Western settings. He's a senior lecturer, sorry. I'm getting everyone's...
Actually, that's another mistake. Associate professor.
You are full prof.
No, not full associate.
Associate, there we go. Americanization everywhere. There we go. He's the author of 3 books, Powering Empire, which has a wonderful cover, On Time, and Names Without Faces. And he's currently working on a social and cultural history of temperature in the modern Middle East. And finally, we have Claudia Leal, who's associate professor in the Department of History at the University of the Andes in Bogotá, although she's a PhD in geography. I'd like to talk to you, Claudia, about how you get in a history department, how you got them to let you in. She's a founding member of the Latin American and Caribbean Society for Environmental History, and her research focuses on both the formation and the present state of peasant societies in rainforest environments, and on the role of racial categorization in shaping Latin American societies in the 19th and 20th centuries. So without any further ado, I'm going to let the speakers each speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A, and we'll just play that by ear and see what the questions are, but we'll give everyone a chance to respond. If I can ask the participants to use the Q&A function to give their questions, type out your questions, and please state who the question is for at the top so that the speaker can see. If it's for the whole panel, just say that, just so they know and can look for the questions that, that are for them and be thinking about their answers as we go along. Okay, Joanne, take it away.
All right, thank you, Tarak. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me and for putting on such a fabulous conference in COVID times. And I'd like to thank Tarak for agreeing to chair this train. And I guess I have the dubious honor of going first. So yeah, well, let me get started. So in my research, I've thought quite a lot about the idea of emptiness. And so I think in this talk, I would like to explore this concept of emptiness and what it means for landscapes in particular to be empty. So I think no landscape is really truly empty. So places we typically think of as empty, so deserts, wastelands, the open oceans, are all really teeming with life and vibrancy. So what type of politics is at play when we envision a given landscape to be empty? So part of what we mean when we say a landscape is empty, perhaps, is an ontological emptiness. So the absence of a certain type of human presence. Indeed, this is what we mean when we say building or a city square is empty. It lacks a density of human activity in the to and fro of human bodies and ideas as they rush past and sometimes collide to create new people, ideas, and politics. In fact, this is a fundamental vision of what we mean by modern civilized society, this abundance of human activity. But if we look closer, perhaps emptiness is less about what's missing than what we miss, less about the absence of activities and the lack of activities that we value. So on a late September day in 1935, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before an expectant crowd in the Arizona desert to dedicate the Hoover Dam, known at the time as the Boulder Dam. He started his speech by describing the empty desert before the construction began. He said, 10 years ago, the place where we are gathered was an unpeopled, forbidding desert. In the bottom of a gloomy canyon whose precipitous walls rose to a height of more than 1,000 feet, flowed a turbulent, dangerous river. The site of Boulder City was a cactus-covered waste. The transformation wrought here is a 20th century marvel. He goes on to describe the dam as a beautiful and great structure that transformed an empty wasteland into a useful and productive space. However, Roosevelt's desert was not only teeming with non-human life, from the rattlesnakes, the jackrabbits, to the dangerous river, but it was also not empty of human societies in the native tribes that lived there. So Roosevelt's unpeopled geography denotes the absence of a particular type of people, the people that mattered, modern, technological, American, the type of people that can conquer nature and usher in an era of progress. Here, Roosevelt's description of the empty Arizona desert reinforces long-standing global hierarchies that privileges certain types of human communities politically and normatively above others. Even today, indigenous geographies continue to be depicted as empty landscapes, from the American West to the Arctic to Western Australia, paving the way for more civilized and more modern peoples to transform the emptiness. You think about it, perhaps at other times when we describe an empty landscape, it's an epistemic emptiness. So the absence of discernible meaning attached to a given landscape. Indeed, this is what we mean when we say a document or a promise is empty. It is devoid of meaning that can be understood or deemed credible. This implies a lack of credible knowledge about a given geography. And in many ways, this is also an absence of history. As environmental historian David Blackburn wrote eloquently, that what we call landscapes are neither natural nor innocent, they're human constructs. How and why they're constructed, many would say imagined or even invented, belongs to the stuff of history. But the question remains then, whose history gets to be inscribed in the landscape? In the late 19th century, the empty global geography that dominated the Western colonial imagination was inland sub-Saharan Africa. And it was explorers like Henry Morton Stanley and Joseph Conrad that gave meaning to this foreign geography. And these writers, along with the cartographers and legal experts that followed, painted a conceptual emptiness for European audiences. In his 1885 book, Stanley describes the Congo Basin as possessing extreme historical barrenness. He writes, "No grand event is connected with its name. Nothing has ever been performed in connection with the Congo to make its history popularly interesting to those who are not engaged in commerce or some special study of it. No military, naval, or scientific enterprise of any magnitude is associated with its name." The sentiment would later be echoed in Hegel's writing when he described Africa as Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. So this sense of emptiness, historical emptiness, the lack of meaning attached to a given landscape, reinforces cartographic emptinesses of the latest scientific maps of the 19th century, as well as legal emptiness in the concept of terra nullius. All of this emptiness acted as an invitation to European colonizers to fill it with their own practices, morals, institutions. Stanley even narrated his own excitement about this emptiness. "Blank as it is," he writes, "it has a singular fascination for me. Never has white paper possessed such a charm for me as this has, and I have already mentally peopled it, filled it with the most wondrous pictures of towns, villages, rivers, countries, and tribes." Of course, the Congo was not really empty of human society, and late 19th century Europe knew that. So the argument for emptiness boils down not to a physical emptiness, but to which perspectives and knowledges mattered and which did not. This geographic imaginary uses a language of emptiness to elevate certain types of viewers. It is an argument that reinforces global hierarchies, that privileges some narratives of place as more morally compelling and more politically powerful than others. And I think we could see this continues today in the way we see the global south or the periphery as empty landscapes outside the narrative of our histories. So perhaps more fruitfully, we should theorize emptiness as an active construction of landscapes. Rather than absence, emptiness is a power-laden narrative about what types of politics and knowledges should be made visible above others and what should be unseen, unheard, and unmade. Constructing an empty landscape, then, is not easy or a natural process. It requires a lot of power. And it's precisely this power that underpins the global ontological and epistemic hierarchies created by notions of empty landscapes, and therefore our prerogative and even responsibility to fill it with the things that matter so that the empty space can be made useful. Rebecca Solnit's scholarship focuses on the construction of emptiness around Cold War nuclear test sites in the Nevada desert and its transnational connections to similar sites in Kazakhstan. She highlights the violence done by prevailing narratives that these sites were somehow empty landscapes, that nuclear tests wouldn't harm. There would be no harm caused by these nuclear explosions. As Rob Nixon notes in his analysis of what he calls unimagined communities wiped out by the construction of megadams, emptiness is an industry that needs constant rhetorical replenishment. The promotion of megadams depends on such emptying out, on actively administered invisibility. I think we can stretch this analysis beyond megadams and nuclear test sites to encompass other grand techno-capitalist schemes of modern life, from urban economic zones to oil and gas pipelines to ports, airports, and commercial corridors. The creation of these monuments to modernity often requires an emptying out of the landscape first. Hidefumi Nishiyama's work examines the politics of ignorance behind the construction of the US military base on Okinawa and the particular discursive work the US Department of Defense had to do to paint the area surrounding the base as empty prior to construction. The long-standing conception of islands as empty creates fertile ground for the idea that we, in the political core, can simply dump our political problems there. An imaginary that framed early Nazi German plans to relocate the Jewish population to Madagascar, and most recently, perhaps, inspired Priti Patel's exploration into whether UK asylum seekers might be relocated to South Atlantic islands. And here in the last few minutes, I think it might be worth briefly thinking towards the 21st century and the empty spaces that capture our political imagination and inform our futuristic notions of utopias and dystopias. For example, the Antarctic has long been celebrated as an empty and pristine landscape. Its crystalline silences luring explorers to their cold but glorious deaths. But the icy Antarctic landscapes are not empty. They're full of frozen borders, its geographic features already stamped with gendered markers of conquest, from a Dal land named after a French explorer's wife to Marie Byrd land named after the wife of an American explorer. And even the conduct of science there in Antarctica has become acts of possession that fill the landscape with our ideological and political baggage. Further, we take the same constructs and hierarchies to outer space, where the emptiness is filled not only with the technological cornerstones of our modern communication systems, but with our garbage. And we even dream of mineral wealth and territorial conquest on the moon and other celestial bodies. So it seems to me that in the promise of empty space beyond Earth, the future seems to mimic the present, as this heavenly emptiness echoes loudly with our earthly ambitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for a great opening talk. I'll turn it over to Bentley for the next talk. Go for it, Bentley.
Thank you, everybody. I see lots of friends in the participant list, and I'm really happy that you're able to join us. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and everyone else who made this event happen. Okay, so, in the time that I have, I think really all I can do is kind of lay out my pain, lay out the problematic that I'm trying to work within. If there's a little bit of time in there, I will give us maybe some Humboldt, which I've been thinking a lot about recently. Okay, so as many of you might know, my previous work really posed the climate as an object of governance. And I define governance objects really building on Corey, Lebrun, Sturple, and others as entities or practices that have been constituted as self-contained units that are distinct from other objects, events, and actors. And I posited these as kind of hybrid entities, not just disembodied ideas or norms, but really entities that have both a physical and a knowledge component, as well as a practical component, an enactment, a way of being in the world. And on this basis, in my 2017 article, Producing the Climate, I built a theory of the co-production of epistemic objects as the interaction between state steering and scientific assembly. But the analysis in that work was primarily discursive. And in my current work, and ever since I really published that piece, I've been trying to think about how to go beyond the sort of ideational frame of my earlier training and my earlier work into a more material mode, let's say, although I think that these terms ultimately have to be abandoned. And so how have I been doing that? So in my current work, which is hopefully going to be a book, sometime before the end of the world, although one never knows when either of those things might happen. I've been thinking about the climate less as a object and more formation, as a real hybrid in the sense that it brings together ideas, infrastructures, molecules, thermodynamics, and perceptions and understandings of the world itself, all as part of the climate itself. So I've been thinking in terms of climate formations, and I'll just define a formation in simple terms here as a concatenation of knowledge, nature, and geopolitics. And I'll get to why each of those elements is kind of important over the course of this talk. But for now, I'll just say that knowledge really encompasses the epistemic communities and infrastructures that produce and disseminate scientific ideas and expertise. Nature in this frame is comprised of the actual geophysical and biological dynamics that comprise the ocean, the atmosphere, and the other kind of subsystems that we think of as comprising the climate. And geopolitics here includes, basically everything that Rosenberg would teach us under the form of UCD, of uneven and combined development, which is really the whole basis of international politics and its basis in state imperatives and political, economic, national systems of production, exchange, and consumption. And I say national here, but really we can talk about any kind of political unit. So we have nature, geopolitics, and knowledge. And a formation is the folding together of these elements into a dynamic stability. That's kind of how I'm currently thinking about it in a processual ontology, which would be akin to a geological formation, which is to say that a geological formation is unfolding in movement along certain timescales, but along other timescales, it appears to be predominantly stable. And I'll kind of get to why I think that this kind of geological conceptualization of the climate as the folding together of these basic subsystems is important. But I just want to say one other thing, which is that social science since the 1950s has really been focused on systems and modeling systems. And what I want to try to do is kind of get away from that. While I am thinking in terms of these kind of distinct systems, knowledge, nature, and geopolitics, the empirical analysis of the book is really about the folding together of each of these. So nature and knowledge folded together in processes of scientific discovery and examination. Geopolitics and knowledge folded together into processes of co-production. The third one, which is really about the folding together of geopolitics and nature in what we think of now in the scientific literature as radiative forcing, which is the actual effect that geopolitics has on the climate. So really looking at these processes of scientific development, forcing, and co-production. So, in this problematic, the emergence of the environment as a problem of governance was kind of the frame that we were given to operate in for this panel, is the establishment of an object environment within this larger formation, this larger unfolding of climate. That's the way I would conceptualize it. And this formation of an object, the climate or the environment or labor or nation or state, any of these epistemic arcs, are hiding certain elements of the formation in kind of a classical Marxist way that he uses the term social formation. But my own reading of formation will be more Deleuzian than Marxist. So what am I kind of trying to do with this setup? Well, maybe I'll just kind of get an entry point into when would we say that the climate formation in its kind of broadly current dynamic stability first emerged. And for that, we can kind of dive very quickly into the debate about the origin of the Anthropocene. And Lewis and Maslin have proposed 1610 as a golden spike. And they chose 1610 because that's the era in which there was, a 7 to 10 parts per million dip in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, which designated really the arrival of Europeans as settlers into the New World. Between 1492 and 1650, more than 50 million indigenous Americans were killed by war, enslavement, and famine. And they mark this as sort of the beginning of the Anthropocene. And also it's really the beginning of modern capitalistic anthropogenic climate change, if you want to think about it in those terms. Lewis and Maslin's proposal has been subject to some really interesting critiques, one which I'd like to highlight from Catherine Youssef, who argues that this proposal, like other golden spikes, kind of betrays the tendency of white geology to hide the coloniality and anti-Blackness of the Anthropocene itself. For Youssef, the idea that the genocide of indigenous peoples is the collision of the old and new, which is Maslin and Lewis's language, elides the sort of brutality and sadism and death of that encounter. The false symmetry of a collision fails to recognize the directed colonial violence, eviction, rape, mutilation, and disease that disrupted the ecological belonging and viable food economies that pre-existed the European arrival in the New World. And moreover, the very language of old and new instantiates a world moment, really, using the ethnocentric terms of the colonizer. So this is Youssef's critique, and instead she really wants to bring us back to 1452, when the first African slaves were put to work on Portuguese plantations on the west coast of Africa. And for her, this broader history really opens up the formation of a world system, not really even as a capitalist system, but as a colonial system first. And we can see sort of the erection of a capitalist world system on the basis of the kinds of subjugations that Joanne was really helpfully pointing out in her comments on the importance of constructing landscapes within all of this. With subsequent to that, we have the development of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is really the massive release of geologically compressed solar energy that enabled material goods production to reach new levels and permitted the expansion and intensification of global colonialism and global trade networks. Britain it's not an accident that the first hegemon, the first actual state that can really project power over the whole globe is during the fossil fuels era. So the fact that we have and talk about hegemony today has to be kind of located within this caloric history. And the fossil fuels revolution is really an intervention in the kind of land-based caloric system of the early modern era that Lewis and Maslin and Youssef are really having a debate about, in which slave labor is a key component of an agricultural system where the calories are all coming from the sun, but some of those calories are being put through slave labor as a means to enable production in sort of proto-industrial periods. So from the get-go, we kind of have this alliance of state power, colonialism, and thermodynamics, which is really the foundation of the climate formation. Whether we date it at 1452 or 1610 is kind of really an academic debate, let's say. So I think that within that frame, it's really easy to see how we're kind of like basically still stuck within that formation, right? I could the book really goes from that very beginning all the way up to the present, and kind of showing us that we really basically haven't been able to break the alliance of the fossil fuel state with colonial hierarchy and capitalist production regimes, and really I don't think any of that will be surprising or contentious to anybody here, but I guess what I'm trying to do is within that think about where the space for agency is within the present moment. And here I think about the potential of the kind of performative dimension of the process theory that I'm trying to bring to bear here anyway. But there's kind of something that gives me pause in that, which is that this wouldn't be the first time that somebody tried to interject process theory into the understanding of human relations in the earth. And for that, I kind of go back to Humboldt. And Humboldt posits, along with a lot of his romantic contemporaries, a principle of movement, a natural principle of motion, which he then uses to justify racial hierarchy. This is all in Cosmos, his great crowning work, some say. His romanticism really led him to say that some races, this is a quote, some races clinging as it were to the soil are supplanted and gradually annihilated by the dangerous vicinity of others whose social state is more advanced, leaving them behind in a faint historical trace of their existence. And in fact, he even uses this phrase that there is a curse of standing still, which really reminds me of Trotsky's UCD and the stuff that I've learned from Justin Rosenberg. And so for him, this principle of motion in this romantic cosmology really is the basic foundation of a racial hierarchy. It is odd because in his naturalistic writings, Humboldt explicitly denies that there's such a thing as a racial hierarchy, right? He says that we are a unity, there's a unity of mankind because mankind operates according to the same unified natural laws, another kind of romantic notion. But at the same time, he believes in a set of principles which allow certain nations to sort of naturally dominate and conquer others. But he's doing this from really within what I would recognize as being a kind of processual mode of understanding. And it's also deeply naturalistic, which is what I'm trying to do also in the book, which is to try to insert humanity directly into the climate. Our perceptions of the climate, our perceptions of the environment are a constitutive element of the very biophysical and geophysical system since 1452 or 1610 or whatever. So these two leads that I have, that naturalism, deep naturalism, and processualism will help us to kind of create a cosmological break with modernity that will allow us to see a way out of this formation, at least on the epistemic side, are sort of already fraught and already sort of colonial. So I'm kind of struggling with that, and I'll just present that as a key for discussion. But then the second piece of this is how do we break out of the sort of more material dimensions of the current formation? And there I would say that the possibility that the immense thermodynamic advantage that wind and solar have over fossil fuels, like to generate calories from fossil fuels, you need to take it out of the ground, ship it to a factory, light it on fire, waste 70% of the energy when you light it on fire in order to turn a turbine. Well, with wind, you just set the turbine up and you turn it. Wind has a tremendous thermodynamic advantage over fossil fuels. And further, you don't need a massive distribution system, which can be protected by the state, right? And this is Timothy Mitchell's work on carbon democracy. In order to deliver the fuel from wind, you just set up the turbine and you let it run. And it's broadly the same with solar. You need some industrial capacity in order to produce the machines. But there's a possibility of breaking the alliance between the state and the thermodynamic nature of fossil fuels, which is working on the material side of this formation. So against the Marxists and against the other folks who are really noting the materiality of the moment going back to 1492 and saying, well, we can't do this without eliminating capitalism, which sort of puts us in this like very passive and deterministic space. I'm trying to kind of like show the Whiteheadian dimension of the process here, which is that there is a possibility for creativity, for breaking, for producing something new in the present moment. And we have to kind of find a way out of the formation from the formation if we're going to have any hope of kind of saving the planet over the next 21st century. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bentley. That was great. Okay, on to Barak. Please take us away.
Thank you. Thank you, Tarak, for chairing, and thank you, the organizers, for organizing and for inviting me. So in responding to the provocation of how the environment is figured in political processes and in attempts at controlling both people and space, I, like Bentley, also thought I would draw attention to what is arguably the key engine responsible for the current environmental transformation and environmental crisis, what I call global carbonization. So I don't pick the moment 1452 or 1610, but we know that the crisis is a hyperobject that can have multiple entry points or starting points. And in my narration, the story begins around the first third of the 19th century. This is the moment where the hydrocarbon economy goes global. And understanding the history of the global spread of fossil fuels, of global carbonization, is indispensable for any program of global decarbonization today. The process of global carbonization connected British industrialization and imperialism. In the book on which this short presentation is based, and which Tarak said had a nice image, a book I published earlier this year, Powering Empire, How Coal Made the Middle East and Sparked Global Carbonization. And the nice image is a homage to the aerial photographer Bernard Lang, whose work also adorns the Millennium Program. I play with the neologism colonialism, COAL, to capture this nexus, this linkage of energy and empire. But whatever we choose to call it, it is clear from my research that the non-Western world was indispensable for the process of global carbonization as a market for British coal, as a laboratory to develop key coal-fired technologies, as a setting for what is called ghost acreage or phantom carrying capacity. In other words, places like Egypt function as a space supplying raw materials such as cash crops that were irrigated by coal-fired pumps and transported on board steamers and railways that are also coal-fueled, of course, and are processed in Western Europe by means that are also coal-fueled. Such industrialization of agriculture was made possible first by exporting British coal to all these imperial peripheries, but gradually by an embrace of local coal extraction in a rather limited capacity in the Ottoman Empire, and much more intensively in India, in China, places whose coal addiction is very evident today. And you can replace, of course, Turkey for the Ottoman Empire for the present moment. So despite very prevalent claims that the history of energy is a story of energy transitions, of transitions between energy regimes, that coal replaced sustainable powers, that coal itself was replaced by oil, and that according to some accounts, we are in a post-oil moment characterized by renewables or what have you, I would argue that we are still very much neck deep in the age of coal. So the globalization of coal, the globalization of the steamship, of the steam engine, of industrial agriculture, of industrial processing, created new realities on land and at sea, above surface and underground and also underwater. It created new environments, new links and corridors, like a corridor that interests me in particular, a system of coaling depots that connected the British Isles to Gibraltar, Malta, Port Said, Aden, and Bombay. And what we today call the Middle East was the very result of this steamer transportation, which gradually replaced the circumnavigation of the Cape of Good Hope, sailing around Africa. The very middleness, if you want, of the Middle East emerged as part of making this region part of the same environment with what plays in its east and its west, placing it within this artificial archipelago of coaling depots that I mentioned. Now, this transformation cannot be reduced to transportation or to infrastructure alone, because these connected environments exchanged flora and fauna, as well as people and ideas and political institutions. And as far as the human component goes, we're talking about coal heavers and colonial officials, telegraph operators, water desalination experts. So there's a lot of expertise, techno-scientific expertise moving around. So, for example, coal-fired water ballasting of steamers, this is the mechanism that allows these vessels to retain a low enough center of gravity to be bottom heavy enough. And we're talking about a contraption that links the steam engine to a pump that sucks in water to compensate the weight lost by burning through a ship's coal supply. This process of water ballasting entails also pumping to the ship's tank zooplankton and phytoplankton from one part of the sea and dumping it in another part of the sea, churning the oceanic soup, if you will, creating in turn very vibrant fisheries in places like Port Said, igniting a feeding frenzy in which humans, but also other creatures, predator fish and water birds can take part. Now, this fishery made possible sustaining a growing human population that fed off this meat and sold it. Again, by the way, Port Said fishermen can freeze the meat of fish and of water birds by means of coal-fired ice makers, ice machines, and sell it in the Egyptian interior, in Port Said's coastal neighbors, and so on and so forth. And I find this quite striking because, today we associate the spread of fossil fuels with what we call the sixth mass extinction, right, with the reduction of biodiversity. But in its early stages, global carbonization meant that invading species actually traveled to new environments. Now, lest we think of this history or of the story of the multi-species encounter as a story of convivencia, of coexistence, I should hasten to add that this vibrancy under and above water created multiple frictions, not only between fish or between fish and birds, but also between people. And it was eventually translated into intercommunal friction. So, for example, Egyptian fishermen were not allowed to use firearms or dynamite to capture neither the fish nor the birds, these birds that flock to kind of take part in the fishery, and they can only use their nets. Subjects of European councils could use such firearms. And this introduces rifts and tensions into communities of fishermen. So what we see happening in Port Said is that dichotomies like local versus foreigner, urban patterns such as the split city can be traced back to the multi-species encounters that are animated by the proliferation of fossil fuels. Now, this environmental transformation was also the result of the proliferation of various kinds of knowledge systems, fishing methods, of course, but also engineering, submarine cartography, telegraphy, geology, stratigraphy, thermodynamics, and this is an interesting kind of junction vis-a-vis Bentley's talk. Historicizing thermodynamics, I think, is quite crucial, and kind of seeing how it is inflected as it globalizes, as it kind of travels around the globe. And like thermodynamics, many of these technosciences travel in translation and are inflected in significant ways. And this is also true for political theory, for political concepts, and perhaps most importantly, for political possibilities. These also traveled along the corridors I've described, and also in an inflected form. This can be demonstrated actually with the famous notion that was mentioned before, T. Mitchell's carbon democracy. So as this story goes, coal allowed British miners a new kind of power to demobilize the entire country with their strikes, thus forcing employers to allow them entry into participatory politics. But as I just showed, energy and the energy sector, the process of global carbonization was global. We're talking about a global sector, and strikes underground in Cardiff or Newcastle and elsewhere in the British Isles reverberate very powerfully in Gibraltar, in Malta. Miners in Zonguldak, in the Ottoman coal coasts, are hearing rumors about these British strikes, and they respond with their own spontaneous strikes. They talk a very similar talk of demanding very similar rights. This is true also for coal heavers in Port Said, for firemen and stokers in the Gulf of Aden. So we're talking about an interconnected system that experiments with a global strike. And this forces British mine owners who are often involved also in mining in other places. The Glenmorgan coal company is involved in Zonguldak in this kind of Ottoman sector, in this Ottoman coaling sector that I just mentioned. And they're also involved with steamer lines and railway lines in Port Said and in Aden. The companies are vertically integrated, in other words, and they are forced to cut a deal, to make a bargain. So the rights they grant to the British working class come directly at the expense of all these other actors, all these other settings. And we see a simultaneous, vis-a-vis the rise of carbon democracy, we see an intensification of authoritarianism, of the criminalization of strikes and unionization, right? So carbon democracy in Western Europe comes hand in hand with carbon autocracy, if you will, in the Middle East. So what I tried showing about Port Said in the minuscule kind of micro locale, the development of splits between groups of people, was also evident on a transnational scale, on a global scale. So to sum this all up, environments fabricated and interconnected through the proliferation of fossil fuels and technoscience did not result in the homogenization of space or of knowledge or of political possibility. As with the spread of invading species, an equilibrium at home did not mean a similar balance abroad. And even more strikingly, even more starkly than in the zoological or botanical analogy, what I've tried to show was how maintaining a political equilibrium at home often depended on undermining a similar possibility outside or abroad. It is the very connectivity within the framework of a single environment and the standardization of its mechanization, of its biotia, of its flora, that introduce political rifts and inequalities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to the speakers for being so well behaved on time. I don't have all the usual tricks to keep you to time, but it's very good. It's very much appreciated. To the audience, please start feeding in your questions. We have a couple, but please get us going. So when we get to the discussion stage, we have something to start with. And with that, to our last speaker, Claudia, please. Want to unmute yourself, Claudia? The microphone symbol down on the lower left. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I had just lost the Zoom. So thank you very much to organizers. Thank you to Tarak for chairing this session. It is a pleasure to be with all the other speakers. I have actually prepared a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share my screen so that you can see. Let me get this going here. So I'm going to be talking about an environment that it's close to my heart, that it is important for Latin America's international relations and also for the health of the planet. That is tropical rainforests, or rather jungles. 60% of the world jungles are located in Latin America. What I have decided to do today is to share two stories, or to talk about two particular cases that involve empires and different ways of shaping and understanding the forest. That is, of knowing this particular environment and of building landscapes, which ultimately define whose jungles these are. So let me get into my first case. This first case comes from this book that I published a couple years ago called Landscapes of Freedom. And it's going to take us back to the 18th century, to the Spanish Empire. So what you see here is a map of the entire Spanish Empire. And knowing that many of you are not familiar with Latin America, I wanted to bring your attention to this part of the Spanish Empire called the Viceroyalty of New Granada. As you all know, the Spanish were keen in finding gold and silver wherever they went. They found a lot of silver and very little gold. Most of the gold that they mined in the 18th century came from a rainforest region, and a very particular rainforest region for that matter, which is the Pacific coast of the country that it's now called Colombia. It is a particular rainforest because it's probably the rainiest place in the entire planet. Let me get this. So the gold being underneath the forest, what the Spanish did is they brought black slaves, they brought enslaved people from Africa and from other parts of New Granada to be able to mine this gold. In so doing, they created what became the largest area in Hispanic America, inhabited mainly by Black people. This was the #1 gold producing area of the Spanish Empire in the 18th century. Now, if we move forward to the 19th century, two big changes happened. Empire disintegrated, and what we have now is a republic, a nation state in the making, and slavery ended slowly. It's a long story to tell, but for the matter, we start with slaves, and now we have free people who came to know these jungles through their labor and by inhabiting them. What we see in these pictures are two ways of working in this particular rainforest environment. The big picture is about mining. This is placer mining for gold, which continued throughout the 19th century into today. And in the small picture, you see agriculture. So people, by living, getting to know, giving meaning to this land, to this environment, created particular landscapes, the most conspicuous trait of which is what you see here, is what you see in the river levees, where you see, agriculture of mixed crops and the houses that these people built. Now let me move forward to the 20th century and to the second half of the 20th century, when two things happened in Latin America and in Colombia in particular. The first one is this drive for development of the post-war years and the building of expertise and experts coming in and trying to figure out how to make the most of what the resources this underdeveloped country had. And some of the experts that came about for the first time in this particular part of the world was forestry. While you have forestry developing in Europe in the 19th century and in places like Chile and Mexico in the early 20th century, in Colombia, forestry only arrived in the second half of the 20th century. And they discovered what probably was known for a long time, and it's that most of the country is forested. So in 1959, the Colombian state passed a law that created 7 forest reserves over 58% of the national continental territory. One of them in the Pacific coast of Colombia. So if you can see, you have the Andes coming in, and the area between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes is this place where the descendants of African slaves brought by empire to mine gold built their lives throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. But creating a forest reserve here meant signaling this area as needing to be eternally in the public domain. Because forests, and this lets me to build some relations with what Joanne was saying earlier, this area was not considered empty. It was full, but it was full of trees. And because it was full of trees, and trees, you know, are present for God, because these trees had not been planted, this area could be considered a natural area. And because it was natural, it belonged rightfully to the state, and it could not be titled. So the creation of a forest reserve in this area through the lens of a particular science, which is forestry, effectively what it did was it stripped those those slave descendants that I was talking before of the possibility of getting titles to the area they had been inhabiting for 200 years. However, the story eventually changed. In the 1980s, Catholic missionaries in the region helped organize the people and created this social movement that exerted pressure. And there was a particular political moment with the creation of a new constitution in 1991 that led to a law in 1993 that allowed for the titling of these forests to the Black people that inhabited them through not individual titles, but collective titles, titles to community. In this manner, about 150 collective titles were granted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you know, covering in effect most of this region. So what you have here is this change in ways of knowing the region, people through their lives and experiences, forestry on the other side, different agents, determining who gets the chance to shape the land, who gets the chance to build landscapes in this area. But in the end, what matters the most is who gets a chance to own and manage these particular landscapes. My second story is going to bring us to this area over here, and it's based on a documentary that I made with my friend Pablo Mejia. It's taking us also to the 20th century when the Spanish Empire had, you know, completely disintegrated and the US was becoming a world power and an imperial power in Latin America. One of the ways in which the US exerted its power through Latin America, and one of the ways that it's less known, has to do with science. And in the early 20th century, very important for what became known as ecological research was the establishment of research stations that would allow to know all the complexities of life, and in particular of tropical life, where life is effectively more complex. So starting in the very late 19th century, but mostly in the first decades of the 20th century, the US built several research stations, mostly in the Caribbean, but also in some other parts of Latin America. Latin Americans also started building stations, but soon a rising power, and here we're moving again to the second part of the 20th century, the Japanese, who were not so much interested in tropical ecology as the Americans, but were interested in primatology. And the reason why the Japanese manifested their imperial self through primatology is because Japan is the only place in the Northern Hemisphere that has monkeys. So the Japanese started studying in the 1940s their own monkeys, and then with the interest, not so much in the monkeys themselves, but in understanding human evolution. As Japan grew stronger, they started moving to different parts of the world. Here we have a picture of one of the Japanese primatologists who started working in Africa, and they eventually came to Latin America. It took them a long time to find a place where to work. They tried several places, at least in Colombia, but settlers came in, chopped the jungle, chased away the monkeys. And finally, in 1986, they teamed up with a group of Colombian ecologists, and they set up a research station that was a pretty successful research station right here in the fringes of Amazonia. So, you know, Amazonia covers this area, and this is part also of the Guyana Shield. Right by the Andes. This is a place that it's particularly rich in biodiversity, even for rainforest standards, and that serves as a corridor between Amazonia and the Andes. What we can see here are some pictures of the station. You can see here Koseisawa, which was the main primatology, some of the monkeys, the river. These were the kind of places where researchers worked. They also shaped the landscape, just as the Black people in the Pacific coast of Colombia, who did so by mining, by agriculture and other ways. The main way in which the scientists left their imprint in the landscape was a very scientific way of doing so, which was the building of trails. Here you have a map of the trail system of the station, and that you could find in all the other stations throughout the forest. And this is very important so that they could actually go find the animals or whatever they were looking at, to build continuous knowledge throughout time, knowing exactly where the things they were studying were found. Now, these jungles were also used by other groups of interest, and in particular, the Colombian guerrillas. The Colombian guerrillas thought of this landscape not as of this environment, not as a biodiversity hotspot or as a corridor for species between the Andes and the Amazon, but as a strategic corridor between the areas, around here, where they had their armies and where they could get funding through the coca economy, and the heartland of the country in the Andes. So this area for them was very important as a corridor, but also as a hiding place, because as they say, finding somebody beneath the canopy is particularly hard. So for a certain time, the scientists and the guerrillas coexisted in certain tension in the area. But eventually, as the guerrillas grew bolder, they kidnapped one of the Japanese primatologists, and that led to the abandonment of the station. We visited, and so the trails, the particular landscape that the researchers had built, disappeared. And the huts that they had built also disappeared. And this is part of the filming that we did in 2018 for the documentary that we made. So what I've been trying to show through with these two stories, which I think are part of the power that history has, this possibility of telling stories, is that knowledge here, let me see, is who produces knowledge about the forest? In what way do they produce that knowledge? How does that knowledge serve to create particular landscapes? And how do these combine to define ultimately who these jungles belong to? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Okay, we have a few questions. A couple for Bentley, one for Joanne. So what I'm going to do to start with is start with Joanne. I'm going to go down the list of the panelists again and encourage you to answer any questions that have been asked directly of you, and to ask questions or comments about the other panelists' presentation and see if we can get some discussion going. I have to apologize, I'm not a specialist in this area, so I can't be quite the same kind of chair or the kind of chair I should be. But I am always really struck by how the climate and the environment forces confrontation and revision of fundamental categories of social theory, of nature, material, society, discourse. These things get thrown up in ways that are really quite something. And they also disrupt the disciplinary division between nature and society. And all of you have had to develop an expertise and engage with scientists in ways that most of us don't. I'd be kind of curious to hear a little bit about what that's like. So without anything further from me, but except for another encouragement to the audience to ask us some questions or make some provocations, I'll turn it over to Joanne. And then from Joanne, we'll go to Bentley.
All right, thank you, Tarak. So I've got a really great question from Marie, which basically made me think a lot, as this kind of idea of emptiness is quite new in my research and my thinking about it. So this is kind of the first shot at thinking through it. So I think this is a great question. My first gut instinct was, oh, they're probably the same thing, just with different inflections. But the more I think about it, the more maybe there is sort of a differentiation that the emptinesses I'm talking about are tame and they're docile. And so maybe they require a bit less work to control than sort of a wilderness, which by nature comes with implications of it being dangerous and threatening. And that's why that needs control. And then which made me think that maybe there's a stepwise issue here. Maybe wildernesses need to be emptied out before we fill it with something. That maybe this is something that's the type of ideational work that needs to be done to a wilderness before it becomes a modern space and before modern society gets its hands on it. Which, and as Claudia was talking, I was thinking, well, maybe also the wilderness gets the flip side of it, particularly today, when we think that wildernesses perhaps need to be preserved in some way or protected, while emptinesses don't have that call on our moral universe, maybe. So I think that's a really great question. It's got me thinking quite a lot in sort of the differences between those two terms. So thank you so much. I had a question, I guess, for Oanne. In sort of hearing you talk about colonialism and sort of the carbonization coming along with colonialism and sort of the modern trappings of a coal society, as you were saying. I was wondering whether or not you saw any sort of also the budding idea of environmentalism also coming in through colonialism, particularly a certain type of environmental preservation. Was that also part of the imperial package as in your story? So I was quite curious about that.
Thank you, Joanne. Go for it, Oanne.
Yeah, one could, I suppose, retroactively detect proto-environmentalisms. And we see that with coal pollution, we have a critique thereof. And that critique, interestingly, is articulated in rather different ways in different places. There's a critique of the effects of coal use in London in the 16th and 17th century, right? The smog is an early modern phenomenon. But when fossil fuels travel to Istanbul and to Cairo, they trigger a completely different set of critiques. And the question of whether we want to package them as alternative environmentalism or as proto-environmentalism is an analytical question for us. But obviously they are there. There is attention drawn to the immoral nature of using these materials. There are questions raised about futurity. So the question of future generations and also of past generations. What is their role in kind of thinking about the extraction and the production of coal? Coal in the Ottoman Empire is thought through the Islamic category of rikaz, buried treasures buried, deposited by God underground for the benefit of the entire community. So not only pollution, but the very revenue that is generated from using coal can be inflected ethically. There are different kind of ethical systems that are activated. So I don't have a good answer to the question of whether this is environmentalism. I guess this is up to us. And this is a political maneuver. If we want to yoke that to the familiar environmentalism that emerged, there is environmentalism in Ruskin's England and in the 1970s US. And so environmentalism is also a hyper object in a sense. And the kinds of coalitions, the kinds of global coalitions we want to forge or rather the kinds of local specificities that we want to insist on are, I guess, political choices that we make, ad hoc.
Thank you, Oanne. Apologies, Bentley, I screwed up. I'd meant to come to you next, but now over to Bentley.
No worries at all. I feel like the conversation can flow, it's fine. So on the first question from Javier, I would say that within my framework, the example that you highlight of the Spanish-French mission to the Spanish Empire, to me, that sounds like something that I might classify as co-production, which is the interaction of geopolitics and science, where a state imperative, which in this case would be like to develop the naval power of the European hegemonic powers, is really helping to stimulate scientific development and is steering the development of science in certain directions. And I think that that's important to recognize that, the development of science is not linear in that way, but is kind of shaped by the topographies of power that are putting that knowledge to use in various ways. But at the same time, we can't reduce the development of science to that, because science has this other axis, this other process that is being folded into it, which is the interaction between like existing knowledge and nature itself, right? So if the globe doesn't have a particular shape, then actually studying the globe is not useful for the European hegemonic powers. If the wind, you can think of the globe with me, like kind of, I have a globe. Okay, so like you can think of the globe like rotating, and as it rotates, that's what creates the trade winds, right? So the literal place of the globe in space helps create the trade winds. And so without that kind of underlying scientific reality creating the Coriolis effect across the oceans, then European hegemonic power doesn't have the effect that it does, right? When the Venetian traders were trying to be colonialist war capitalists in the Eastern Mediterranean, they were much more restricted because of the caloric nature of that particular part of the world. So I think it's important to realize that power and coloniality are kind of like interacting with science in these complex and folded ways. So I wouldn't say that it's colonial just because it's colonial, like it's colonial because it's part of this larger configuration, of course, but I would classify it in these other ways first. To Philip, I'm really glad that Philip asked this question. Philip's the one person who he's like one of those people that you fear as a writer, because like he's going to be a reviewer and you have to think about what Philip is going to say. So I was already thinking about what Philip was going to say actually, and I'm glad that he's here. So I have a long response to Philip, which I'll drop in the chat. But I think that just very briefly, I'm not choosing Humboldt really. I'm not like trying to find resources in Humboldt. Humboldt is a really important, probably the most important natural scientist, physical geographer working in the middle of the 19th century. And because empirically, I'm just trying to study the history of the formation, and I think that the knowledge is constitutive of the formation, I have to find the knowledge sources that I think are like, cannot be ignored. And I think Humboldt just can't be ignored from that standpoint. Now, once I start reading Humboldt, I think I read him in a more processualist way than maybe other interpreters do, because I'm reading him so strongly through the Romantic lens. And I would say it's not Hegel that really informs my reading of him. It's Goethe and the circle around Goethe that is like, to me, providing the kind of intellectual substance that Humboldt is operating within, and that is sort of more deeply vitalist and processual in that way. And so for me, because I'm trying to reclaim a little bit of vitalism through a sort of a deep, thoroughgoing processual naturalism, he like presents this challenge that I can't ignore because he's in the archive, right? And I have to grapple with the archive as constituted. So that's why Humboldt, basically. And I think we should all comment on Tarak's question, but I'll leave the floor for now.
Okay, thank you, Bentley. Claudia, I think you've got one in there.
Thank you. Yeah, but I'd like to make a comment on Joanne's presentation and the question that you were asked about wilderness. In thinking about what, that we don't have in Spanish, something as clear as wilderness. We always have trouble, when we're teaching in Spanish, what word do you use? And when you go back to the archives, the closest word that's actually very different, thinking of emptiness, is the word desert, is desiertos. That's the word that appears throughout the colonial records. But wilderness, it's full. Wilderness it's powerful, it's disorder, but it's full of life. While desert, although it does not refer to, you know, plants and animals, it's referring mostly to people. It's emphasizing the emptiness and not the fullness that you see in wilderness. So I mean, if you're going to continue working on this, maybe you can have a look at that. And I had a short question for Oanne, if I may. It's, well, curious because I come from the one Latin American country where coal, it's important, you know, it's one of our main exports. We have, you know, these huge coal mines. But Latin America largely skipped that coal phase that you say that there are no phases, you know. We kind of went from biomass to hydroelectricity. So when I was listening to you, I was wondering where this part of the world fits in this big global scheme that you're referring to, and I see it fitting easily when you talk about transportation. You know, you know, the species encounters, you know, they apply for all over the world, but I mean, are you telling a global history that is leaving out one of the world regions? I don't know. So just a question. And for Angus, who asked a question to me and Joanna, how are the colonial politics of emptying of space and the politics of forgetting related? Does emptying space also erase history? What we see in the case of the history of Black people in the Pacific coast is that the space is full, the space is worked, but they are effectively erased from history. A part of the reason why I wrote the book that I wrote was to tell a more complete story of the African diaspora and a more complete story of our national history. You know, an entire region, an entire people that seem to have no place. But what I find interesting in this question that you're asking of the relationship between history and space has a lot to do with the nature of rainforest environments. And it's rainforest environments like the wilderness, you know, they evoke this fullness, this power, this richness. And the kind of mark that Black people left in the environment wasn't a very strong mark. Like if you're flying above the jungle, you would just see the canopy, you know, as if nobody were there before. And then if you come down, you would see it. You wouldn't have to make that huge effort. But usually the history of rainforests is associated with a history of complete transformation, you know, deforestation, 1970s, you know, biodiversity loss, but all these other stories that have to do with important but more subtle transformations of the environment, of the building of all these other landscapes within rainforests, get kind of erased or forgotten. And in the case of the station, well, it actually got erased. You know, when the rainforest reproduces really rapidly, and in a matter of 15 years, it took over and ate, you know, what had been built there before. So the documentary that we did was a way of remembering the story. And you know, Colombia is a country that's obsessed with the armed conflict and the war. And of course, what's most important is the human suffering. But there's also been an important history related to science and the cost of the war for science. And that's partly what we wanted to do with the documentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Okay, I'm going to go back through the program order, and I'm going to get it right this time and give you a chance. So we've got quite a lot of stuff on the table. I know there are questions out there that the participants have in their mind that they've not asked yet. You're running out of time to ask them, and you all know what it's like teaching in COVID times. We all have to be a little bit more forthright with what we want to say and ask. So please do type them in, and the participants can see them, or the panelists can see them as we go along. Joanne.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Claudia, for that. That's really interesting. This the Spanish idea of wilderness kind of translates into desert. So I'll have to look into and think about that more. And I would agree with what you said about, you know, the emptying out of space and the politics of forgetting being related. I would perhaps add on to that, at least from, you know, what I'm talking about, this idea of constructing emptiness is a political process. that it's putting, it's not only erasing sort of the local indigenous histories, but it's also placing that space into our history, which is the Western modern historical trajectory. So that emptying out process is both an eraser, but also a construction of it and forcing it into kind of a trajectory of Western, we can talk about linear, but definitely progressive history. So that's what I would add to Claudia's response, perhaps from my perspective. In terms of the Alexandra's question, that's another really great question about luxurious emptiness, this idea of escape. And I would say that this kind of construction of this luxurious escape where the urban dweller needs to go to recharge and empty ourselves, that's exactly what I'm talking about, that this is a construction and that we've filled this space with our pastoral ideals, basically. And it doesn't matter so much as, you know, what's actually the mountains, the forests, the animals that live there, but what we feel as we encounter it. And I think it has a lot of reflections. You know, Bentley was talking quite a lot about romanticism, reflections and sort of romantic encounters with history, that for, I think, the German romantics, when they looked at nature, it was less about necessarily the rivers and the mountains or the trees, but sort of this sensibility that nature inspired in the human soul, and what that got us. So then nature isn't empty, it's filled with all of our baggage and the way what we want, the utility we want to derive from the empty space.
Yeah, that's
That
great.
it, Joanne? Go for it, Bentley.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here about how we can use the word landscape as like one of these hybrid words, which help us deconstruct the boundary between nature and society, like that Tarak was kind of suggesting. So landscape, you know, in my earlier work, I talked about like the discursive landscape or the landscape of objects or the landscape of problems. And I really do think of that in like a topological metaphor, which is to say that there is like a structure of the ideational space that we're operating in. And so the construction of a landscape is simultaneously both of these things, right? It is both the construction of a set of categories and discourses that have a particular kind of shape and topography, but it's also the literal construction of the space, the arrangement of the space. And Mitchell would remind us that it's literally not just the mental construction of the space, but it's the rearrangement of the space. And Claudia's talk, I think, really helps us to see it that way. So that's one of the things that I think of to speak to Tarak's broader point about how thinking about the environment is kind of like a hammer on all of our concepts, because but we also need to kind of do the work of finding these hybrid concepts that do work on both sides of the former divide, and then we need to like replace our entire vocabulary with these concepts that have this hybridity kind of built into them. And then like maybe 4 generations of scholars after us won't think in terms of these divisions anymore. But you know, we can be kind of brokers with that. And I also wanted to say on the question of science, that I think that the previous way of merging science with the natural sciences has been really like mechanical and mechanist and reductive, which is so there's been a we want to avoid talking about the power of thermodynamics, because that is equated with like this 19th century Montesquieuian world in which the regime type is determined by the mountains or whatever, right? And so there's this 19th century naturalism that was deeply reductive. And so now we're going back to that and saying, wait, okay, calories and thermodynamics were really important. And so that we have to like bring these scientific, not just the concepts, but like we have to bring like the power of the physical entities into our social theories, right? But we need to do so in a way which is non-determinative. And I would say like that's easier said than done from the perspective of somebody who's trying to do it, right? So one of the concepts I'm playing with is from Mead, who in one of his essays on scientific discovery talks about implication. And for him, implication is like when you discover something scientifically, it implies things about the world. So like if you discover the concept of the climate, that implies certain things for how you now understand other biophysical and geophysical system and what scientific discovery is, like the working out of these implications. But like Mead's concept of implication is not a that is a purely logical thing, right? Implication is a result of a problem-driven process of inquiry, and if you know the pragmatists at all, you know that that's like a very capacious space in which to operate. The problem is a capacious sort of thing, and that allows us to insert geopolitics into processes of co-production and things like that. So, but implication at the same time still has this force to it, which is like, if the calories don't work, if the biodiversity isn't there, if the molecular connections don't work, then this doesn't work, right? This literally doesn't work, and that's kind of what I was getting at with like the shape of the earth comment with Aviv earlier. So we need to be like unafraid of allowing the actual like underlying law-like realities of science to enter into our social theories, and not be afraid of that and be like, oh, well, it's positivism, so we can't touch it, or we can't allow it to come anywhere near us, because we're really not going to understand how this stuff worked in history if we don't acknowledge that the power unleashed by coal had a real generative effect on power projection capabilities. And now I sound like Mearsheimer, right? We have to acknowledge that, but at the same time carve out a space for allowing the implications and concatenations and accidents of history to be alive in that history, so that we can seize on those moments in the present. And I would just say that's hard to do, and I'm struggling with everybody else, I think, right now, to try to find a way to do that.
That's a very interesting way to put it, Bentley. But one of the things that listening to, one of the things that occurs to me is not only the problem that we can literally remake the landscape, or the problem that we have to keep in mind what you're calling the real scientific properties of nature in any given part of the world. But it's not so much that past accounts of history and conquest ignored terrain or the natural world. It's that they had Orientalist constructions of it. So Europe got states because it had mountains and forests, and Asia's all open, and we're just going to ignore the diversity of Asian landscape in the way that Paul Kennedy is painting something. And I say that because the science you guys are using is also historical. It's also political. It also changes over time. You all know this. So there's no place to go for the objective account of what the landscape is. Anyway, I'm stepping out of my role. Barak, please take us away.
I actually want to amplify what you're saying, and I can give a quick example. So when thermodynamic travels outside of physics, one of its incarnations is labor science, and it's the idea of the calorie and the human motor, right? Andy Rabinbach's notion of the human body as a machine burning fuel, and that assumes a universal body that is standardized everywhere. But when this theory travels to the Gulf of Aden, British captains and British ship doctors encounter a particular problem. They have this ethos of Somali brown-skinned stokers as heat resistant, as human salamanders, which justifies employing them in the boiler room, 70 degrees, scorching heat. Awful. In the competition for the shittiest job in the 19th century, I think this is ranking very high. So they have to inflect, this universalist thermodynamic body with racial theory to allow these steamers to travel the Red Sea in August. So I think that the project of reconciling social theory with physics or with thermodynamics is a very kind of pertinent one, but a very risky one. So and one that has a long history. I also wanted to quickly respond to Claudia and to pose a question to Joanne and Bentley. So Claudia asked me if I'm ignoring Latin America, and in a sense I am. Of course, I'm learning a great deal from the Colombian exchange. This is kind of the earlier part of the history that I'm telling. And I'm trying to make a shift to the Indian Ocean, a story that was very much Pacific. But I'm trying to insist on telling a global history that is not a story of the entire world. And not only because one cannot, for reasons of competence and mastery of languages and just kind of the limited storage space, one cannot cover everything. But I think there is a value in developing global history that attends to a particular corridor between Aden and Port Said and remain global. And I wanted to ask Joanne and Bentley. Joanne, you were structuring your spiel along the trajectory of, say, from the desert to the space. So emptiness, terrestrial emptiness is then kind of projected outward. And that reminded me of the work of King Stanley Robinson, the sci-fi author, Mars Trilogy, where humanity takes all its problems and exports them to outer space. But at the same time, I'm wondering if the history is not in the reverse. That is, we have a long history of looking at terrestrial affairs from this kind of extraterrestrial perspective, as if from outer space. And 19th century and 19th century climate science, and here this connects to what Bentley is working on, is very so the meteorological observatories are called heavens on earth, and they mimic this kind of God's gaze on the ground. So I'm wondering if the direction should not be reversed, and what happens when we reverse the direction, and also to kind of to link this or to frame this as a question to Bentley as well. I'm reminded of Deborah Cohen's Climate in Motion, where she makes an argument that this kind of extraterrestrial story of climate is changing in the last decade. So in the last decade, the climate prediction models are accurate enough to allow us a terrestrial and a local and regional forecast, whereas even in the early 2000s, climate was a global thing and something that necessitated a globe. So the place of the globe and where we position ourselves within it or outside it is, I think, an interesting kind of issue for both your projects, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about it.
Thank you, Oanne. I'll go to Claudia now, and then I'm going to go through the panel one last time for final comments as we're coming to the end. So Claudia.
Just a short comment on the idea of landscape that Bentley was talking about, of how, and based on your comment on how it can help us go beyond the separation between natural and social. And I would add that the landscape as a way of seeing has also the power of, well, as you've all recognized, of talking about the symbolic and the very, very material at the same time. But I've been wondering around, because this idea of going beyond the separation between nature and society or nature and culture comes up again and again and again, in the classroom and meetings, and everybody's trying to create new words and new ways, hybrid and whatnot. But what I find is that no matter if the word you choose is hybrid or landscape or whatever, you're always going back to the idea that hybrid or landscape are precisely allowing us to talk about how things are made of both social and natural. So in the end, your starting point is having the two separate ideas on your mind ontologically, so that you can make sense of reality, and then using concepts and strategies and whatnot to bring them together. And I wonder if what we would want to do is really kind of do away with the human and the social to really talk about this mixed world that we live in, or if kind of where I'm heading to, as I grow older and get stuck in that same discussion over and over, it's okay, let's accept it. It helps us, right, to separate nature and society ontologically, and then you just mix them in the way you're exploring the world, and the discussion doesn't seem that complicated. So if you have thoughts on that, I would appreciate them.
Thank you, Claudia. I see we have one more question coming in. Oh, just someone who enjoyed it. Okay, so we have time for like 1 minute each or 30 seconds each for a final comment. Joanne?
30 seconds. Okay. Thanks, Oanne, for that question in the comments. The past is future and the future is past. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. So I'll have to read the Mars trilogy as well and see what I think of that. On Tarak, what you've been talking about, science. I don't think any of us is discussing of science as objective or an objective knowledge of material reality. I don't think that's the way we're conceptualizing science at all. And I think science is used in various different ways, I think, in our projects for modern projects or colonial projects. And I think, in kind of the research I've been doing on Antarctica, science is even more explicitly being used as conquest, right? So in the absence of effective occupation of a space that can't be effectively occupied, how do you occupy it? You do science. So the use of science in Antarctica then becomes kind of the stand-in for colonialism, for effective occupation.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Bentley, final word.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think that the use of science in my work and the use of science in everybody's work needs to be problem driven. It needs to be driven by what you really want to accomplish with your scholarship and what you're hoping to do. And what I'm hoping to do is help identify creative resources for transformation through capitalist modernity. Capitalist colonial modernity, right? So is there a possibility that we can get out of it, or are we just stuck in it? And I want to identify actual strategies and interventions, not just and possibilities, not just the historical exercise, right? So for me, the history is always driven by a certain need to make interventions in the present. And that's my own particular pragmatist Deweyan frame for why I do the work that I do. And I don't think it's the only one or the best one. And it's one that leads me to have a very instrumental attitude towards science, but also one that is sort of deeply historicist and but at the same time kind of a validly naturalist. So yeah, just everyone has to be problem driven. Think about what you're trying to do with your scholarship, and that will help you sort out how you can use science and concepts like hybrids and all that in a way that makes sense within your own project in a coherent and intellectually honest, but at the same time, still problem-driven way.
Thank you very much, Bentley. A little hope for us there to end on, and knowledge interest rules. And the last, Oanne, you're up next.
Oh no, the last word. So I'll use my last word to join Claudia. I don't know if it's defensible, this stance, but of separating and then hybridizing. But I'm finding myself in a similar kind of getting old modality, and I'm reminded of Gaitari Spivak's deployment of the notion of tactical essentialism. So maybe a tactical anthropocentrism is something that we can go along with, at least for certain purposes.
Thank you, Oanne. That's a great ending comment there. And Claudia, you get the last word.
Well, I guess the last word has to be to thank everybody for the meeting, for being together. It was fun to be with all of you and share this moment. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Claudia. And please join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful discussion to keep us going, spread out across a couple of different continents here, or 3 different continents at least. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody.